understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter.
Welcome to the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Dillon, I have a Master of Divinity, and I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
I'm Sam, I have my doctorate in language and culture, and I study religious linguistics. And today is episode 25, and it's all about the word Jubilee. So let's start out. This is episode 25. The year is 2025.
I was just going to say that.
So it's very intentional here, and it's a Jubilee year. So we're also by an open window, and it's really nice out, so you might hear some background noise a little bit today. As Liz Gilbert often says when she records, if you know who Liz Gilbert is, life is in session. So
That's right. Our dog is also sitting next to us, and she likes to scratch her ears every once in a while. So
and her
you may
collar jingles.
hear her collar.
Yeah. And we live in a town where a lot of people walk by. Okay, so episode 25. It's the year 2025. It's all about the word Jubilee. So let's just dive right in. Leviticus is where you can find a lot of information about the Jubilee. And Jubilee is connected to the ways, again, if you've been listening to all of our episodes, we have provided some background information leading up to this. Jubilee is connected to ways the Israelites situated themselves in time. So they observed the Sabbath, which is the seventh day of each week when humans are told to rest in order to experience their liberation, right? Didn't we do a whole episode on Sabbath? I'm pretty sure we did, yeah.
We did.
So on the seventh day, they observed the Sabbath, right? The first 11 verses of Leviticus 25 discusses the sabbatical year. So on the seventh day, they rest on the seventh year. So every seventh year, the land had to rest. So fields could not be sowed, vineyards could not be pruned, and harvest could not be reaped. So this number 7 is kind of important, right? And then after 7 cycles of sabbatical years, so after 7 times 7 years, there's a Jubilee year. So 7 times 7 is 49. That means the 50th year. So every 50th year, there's a Jubilee year. So what is a Jubilee year? Every 50th year, people, the Israelites, they were instructed by God to observe a Jubilee year. So the next verses of Leviticus 25 discuss this year of the Jubilee. I'll talk about this a little later, but it's also sometimes called the year of the Lord's favor. So we'll talk about that too. But this is essentially a year of rest for the land and a time of deep social renewal. So the word Jubilee comes from the Hebrew word that means ram's horn, which I love. It seems so random, but actually the
random ram's horn.
Yeah. The ram's horn is what was used to sound the start of the Jubilee year. And in Latin, the word Jubilee means to shout for joy. And this word was really influenced by the old French word, I think you say jubilé, which became the English word Jubilee. So it means to shout for joy because the Jubilee year was a time to shout for joy. It was a regularly scheduled time in every generation, once every 50 years, which is about once every generation, for joy and celebration. So every 50th year, that's really important that it's every 50th year because it's once a generation. So ideally in everybody's lifetime, if your life was not cut unexpectedly short, you would experience this Jubilee year. So every 50th year, there were 3 major practices that entice this kind of joy, shouting for joy and celebration. And we're going to talk about all of them. Number 1, actually, can we just back up really quickly?
Okay.
To situate all of this, the Jubilee, you need to remember that the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. That is what Jesus was a student of. He learned about the Torah, and then he taught using the Torah, right?
Right.
And the Torah is, just as the whole Bible is, it's a text about the political situation. It's a text about economics. It's a very sociological text. It's a text about how God wanted God's people to arrange their society. It's a text telling the story about how the Israelites were liberated from Egyptian enslavement. They were liberated from the Pharaoh. And then Leviticus really dives into how they arranged their new life in the desert when they were wandering in the desert and whenever they arrived in Canaan, right? So it's very much about political decisions, economic systems, their social norms, their laws, right? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's interesting that after like long weeks and months and years of working and doing different types of things, being in seasons of kind of hard work and labor, but also in seasons of like repentance and seasons of like watching and waiting and hope. It's interesting because in the season of Advent, which is the first 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, the third Sunday of Advent is known as Joy Sunday, or sometimes a Jubilant Sunday, a Jubilant Day. And the color even changes. So for 3 weeks, for the first 2 weeks, it's blue. And then there's a little break, and the candle on the Advent wreath is a rose-colored candle. Sometimes it looks pink, but it's actually a more rose-colored candle. And then it goes back to blue. So in the moment of that season of watching and waiting and kind of longing, in this elongated season waiting up to Christmas, there's this one little Sunday in the middle of Advent that's called Gaudete Sunday. And Gaudete means joy or jubilant. And the color changes from blue to rose. It's also very interesting that in the season of Lent, the color is purple. And also on the fourth Sunday of Lent, there is something called Lateran Sunday. And Lateran also references a time of joy or jubilance. And the color also changes to a rose color. And so even in the seasons of the church, 2 times a year in these kind of elongated preparation,
we're recognizing the Jubilee.
We're recognizing, even though in Advent, while we watch and wait for the hope of the coming of the Messiah at Christmas, and as we prepare ourselves in prayer, fasting, and almsgiving in Lent, there's this little moment in time that the color changes, the kind of idea of like joy and jubilance comes in, and a lot of times that is done with singing, kind of uplifting songs.
Which is that linguistic thing of shout for joy, which is very much like singing for joy, right? Shout. That's good. That's all really good. And obviously the word jubilant comes from Jubilee, which I should have said when I was
which
talking
has
about
its
the language.
roots in joy.
Right, yeah, that's so good. Mm-hmm. So the Jubilee year is very much a time to shout for joy. Again, it's about politics, it's about the economy, it's about social life. So there's 3 major things that happened every 50 years. Number 1, all debts were forgiven. Number 2, enslaved people were set free. And number 3, land was returned to its original owners. So we're going to talk about all 3 of these things. So the Jubilee year was very much a year to address economic disparities. The Bible states that this is how God wanted God's people to arrange their social and economic system. So as you're listening to what we're saying, I just want to remind you, this is biblical, y'all. Like when people are like, oh, I'm a biblical Christian. When we have politicians who are like, oh, I'm a Christian, I'm a Bible-believing Christian. Well, why aren't we talking about the Jubilee that God demanded? What's another word? Instructed, God. There's a word I'm thinking of. Demanded, instructed, what's another word?
Well, I would say maybe
mandated.
Commanded, maybe.
Commanded,
Demanded.
Yeah, commanded, right? This Jubilee was a law, right? It was treated as law. Now, Jewish people did not observe the Jubilee throughout all of Jewish history. And you'll notice if you actually read the Bible and the whole arc, that whenever they kind of stopped observing these things started to really fall apart. And then the Romans enter in there, and then it really falls apart. But it's biblical. And it's funny how Christians with political power don't talk about this part of biblical law. That's really interesting. So let's talk about these 3 major Jubilee practices. Number 1, debts were forgiven.
Let's talk about this real quick, though.
Sure.
So just because something might be biblical, though, doesn't mean all the time that it is right or it's correct.
Oh, no. I'm not making that argument whatsoever. I'm saying that some people will say, oh, I'm a Bible-believing Christian. That's biblical.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, okay, if you want to live your life according to that value set, fine, then take it the whole way. This is biblical.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that everything in the Bible stands 100% without context and shouldn't be.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, I know that you know that, but for
Yeah,
some
it needs
of
to
our
be said.
listening ears, someone says, well, this is biblical. Well, yes, there's a lot of things that are biblical, but sometimes biblical things are set within a cultural context
Yeah.
and are no longer applicable. And but what we're talking about today, in terms of Jubilee and forgiving debts and letting the land rest and these types of things, these are things that are universal.
There's potential. Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
so number one.
Just so we,
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Number one, debts were forgiven. So every 50th year, meaning once a generation, all debts were ordered to be forgiven. This means that people could start fresh without being weighed down by their financial burdens. And what's really interesting is that words, if you think about like getting bills and banks and finances, words like grace and forgiveness are often used in Christianity. But banks use these words too.
nothing like a good grace period.
Yes, a grace period. Like you have a 2-week grace period, meaning you could pay your water bill 2 weeks late. Or forgiveness, right? Like loan forgiveness, right? It's so interesting that grace and forgiveness, which are very Christian words, very religious words, very like heart-centered words, banks have kind of hijacked them. I think that's so interesting.
But there's not too much going on with the Jubilee in terms of full
banks.
debt forgiveness.
No. So let's just contrast this like biblical and divine instruction to our current economic systems that are obsessed with burying people in debt and profiting off the interest charged.
Ooh.
So we've obviously strayed quite far from this biblical teaching, from this God-ordained teaching. Now, Leviticus chapter 25, verses 36 through 37, if you want to check our work, Exodus chapter 22, verse 25, and Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 19, these texts prohibit the charging of interest to those within your community who are in need. Again, this is a biblical teaching. You are not allowed to charge interest to those in need. And yet,
We charge interest to those in need.
People who are touting their Christianity and their Bible-believing faith have no problem charging interest out the wazoo to people who are in need. I think that's very interesting. So the Bible is full of economic teachings that favor and protect the poor from exploitation. And this gets even more interesting. So in the Lord's Prayer, which can be found in Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 through 13, and Luke chapter 11, verse 4, so many of us say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. However, in the original Greek of Matthew, the word used actually translates not to trespasses, but to debts, meaning financial or moral obligation. So a more accurate reading of Matthew with the Lord's Prayer would be, forgive us our debts as we forgive those.
As we forgive our debtors.
Thank you. As we forgive our debtors. That's interesting. That's so interesting. And that is Jesus pointing to the Jubilee practices.
Yeah, which is really interesting. This is not to get in the weeds too much, but maybe some of our listeners may have had the experience, or maybe they have grown up in a church that was influenced by the Reformed tradition of Protestantism. So that would mean like a Presbyterian church or some UCC churches, the United Church of Christ, or the Reformed Church itself. And in their worship books, when they speak and pray the Lord's Prayer or sing the Lord's Prayer, it is forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And the Reformed tradition within Protestantism has put a great emphasis on the liberation that comes from economic liberation. Mm-hmm. So once again, if you find yourself in a Presbyterian church or a UCC church or a Reformed church, you may hear that in the Lord's Prayer because they have kept with that in their worship resources.
Yeah, that's good. So Matthew, a more accurate translation would be about debts. Now Luke, with the Lord's Prayer, uses a word that actually means sins. So while the original Greek of Matthew uses the word debts, the original Greek of Luke uses the word sins. And that actually makes sense because Matthew was written to a Jewish audience.
Very good. Okay.
That makes you excited?
Oh, that's good.
Matthew was written to a Jewish audience. They would have been very familiar with the laws of Jubilee. So for them to say, like, forgive your debts, talking about debt forgiveness, right? That makes sense. But Luke was written to a Gentile audience, meaning non-Jews. So for them to be pointing to the Jubilee laws, that would have been lost on them in some way. So instead, Luke decided to use the word that means sin. So forgive us our sins.
Which has a kind of that's why we use the word trespasses, because trespasses, you're doing something against someone
right.
in a sinful way, and so and trespasses is a very liturgical.
Yes, for me, trespasses is better than sins there, even though that's what Luke uses. But trespasses feels like something you do towards another human, and that's very much kind of the point. Whereas sin can take on a more grandiose, vague kind of sense.
And there are some modern translations, even for worship resources, that in the Lord's Prayer you would say, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who have sinned against us.
Yes. I don't hate that. I like debt, but that's also because I've been reading, as you know, obsessively about the Jubilee. I should also have said this in the introduction. Our last episode was about the Romans because Dillon and I were recently in Rome. Our episode before that was about Lent. So you're kind of seeing a theme here. We were just in Rome, Italy, and the Vatican City for Lent, but also for 2025, the Jubilee. There are a lot of people doing 2025 Jubilee pilgrimages, which is what Dillon and I just did. So this all kind of ties into our Roman experience as well. So, okay, so back to translations. The English translation of trespasses actually comes from the 14th century Wycliffe Bible. Am I saying that right? Wycliffe Bible. And the 16th century Book of Common Prayer. So the word trespasses, as opposed to like debts or sins, became common in liturgical settings. And it really stuck in many Christian traditions. But again, if you look at the original Greek of Matthew, we can see this echo of Jubilee law and how important forgiveness of debts was in a very literal sense. I feel like if we say the Lord's Prayer using forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, we can get very kind of metaphorical about it. But in its original setting, this was very literal. This was like a very literal, get rid of all debt.
Yeah, here's an interesting thing. Most musical settings of the Lord's Prayer do not use trespasses. They use debt and debtors. So, for instance, in the Lutheran tradition, it has been not in every Lutheran church, but it's a fairly broad tradition that on Good Friday, at the Good Friday service, the Lord's Prayer is not prayed or spoken; it is sung, either by the congregation or sung by a soloist. And the Lutheran Church uses trespasses and those who trespass against us. But when it is sung by someone or the congregation, it's debts and debtors.
That is interesting.
Which is really interesting. I'm not sure if that is an easier...
rhyme?
Rhythmic way of being able to say it instead of trespasses in terms of the written
or if
music.
Hymnists are just more historically inclined.
Yeah, I'm not really sure, but if you sing it or you listen to it sung, most of the time it's going to be debts and debtors.
Okay, so the first thing was debts are forgiven. And if that sounds radical to you, yes. But also Christian history is radical. Jesus was radical. Yes, absolutely. Number 2. Enslaved people were freed. So every 50th year on the Jubilee year, or once a generation, enslaved Israelites were set free. So we had to talk about slavery. Let's talk about enslavement. And that's such a sensitive topic. But in the social setup of the day, you became enslaved when you could not afford to house or feed yourself. People were separated from their family and children. It was devastating. And I use the word but, which makes it seem like I'm justifying enslavement, and that is not what I'm doing. But remember, they didn't have welfare system. This is how it was handled when somebody couldn't feed themselves, when they didn't have food, when they didn't have housing. They didn't have welfare systems, so they became enslaved. They became an enslaved member of a household. This is how it was handled. It's devastating, right? Families torn apart, exploited labor. It's just devastating. Now, the Jubilee law, this is how it happened in many nations, by the way. This is just the order of the day. Again, it's not okay. Thank goodness we have transcended this. We have moved, hopefully, beyond it for good. But Jubilee law ensured that these enslaved people were liberated, and it was not a permanent state. So remember that the Israelites were liberated from Egyptian enslavement. Liberation was the whole point of their life. If you read the Torah and really the whole Bible, liberation is like the theme, I would say. Like the theme. Like Christianity is about liberation, and we're going to talk about that more too. So the Jubilee law made sure that enslavement was not a permanent state. The Israelites were freed from Egyptian enslavement. And the Jubilee laws and practices were about ensuring their liberation was preserved and regularly practiced. So other nations practiced enslavement permanently. But the Israelites and their God instructed them to do things differently by putting restrictions on enslavement. To us, this probably seems basic. And to us, hopefully, you're on board with the fact that enslavement is one of the worst parts of human history. This was thousands of years ago. To put restrictions on enslavement and to promise to liberate every enslaved person each generation, this was a radical statement about liberation. Nobody else was doing this at the time, right? This is something that nobody else was doing at the time that we know of. We have no record of any other group doing this. The Israelites, as far as we know, were the first people to put restrictions on enslavement. And every other nation that we know of, enslavement, once you were an enslaved person, that's it. But this said, okay, you're enslaved, but on the Jubilee year, you'll be set free, a fresh start, no debts, all of that. Often, just a kind of side note, the Bible talks about enslavement. I encourage you to go read the parts where it talks about enslavement. It's often connected to limitations of enslavers and focuses on the freedoms of the enslaved. Again, from our 2025 vision, it's like, we eradicated enslavement in that form. Why didn't they? Well, remember, it's thousands of years ago, but also if you read the biblical texts that talk about enslavement, like Exodus chapter 21 states that enslavement cannot last longer than 6 years unless the enslaved person chooses to remain, and provides rules. Exodus also provides rules about selling daughters and ensures that they were treated as wives rather than property. So, am I explaining that in a way that makes sense?
Yeah,
so
it's still gross behavior, but
it's gross behavior.
But it is there is a regulation there.
Yes, every time the Bible and the Israelites and the Jewish people, whenever it's talking about enslavement, it's always talking about the restrictions. How, like, okay, yeah, there's enslavement, but we're going to do it more ethically than all of the other groups. Which, to us seems like, basic, but to them that was radical, to treat your slaves with respect. That sounds so terrible saying it in 2025, but reading it from their point of view, from their time period, it was a radical stance about enslaved people having rights, right, and having hope for this not being their entire life, I guess is the way to say it, right?
That's a good way.
Yeah. So this is all a foretaste of the Jubilee laws to come for the Israelites.
I thought you were going to say a foretaste of the feast to come. I thought we were getting ready for communion.
Okay, so number 1, debts are forgiven. Number 2, all the enslaved people are set free. Number 3, land was returned to its original owners. So every 50th year, once a generation, ancestral land that was sold was returned to its original family. So when the Israelites came to Canaan, the land was divided and each family was given a plot. In the ancient world, land was passed down throughout generations of families. And family land was used for many purposes. Ancestors were buried on family land. Food to feed the family was grown on the land, right? Like, this land was used for their well-being. They needed it. However, ancient Israelites often sold their land when they found themselves in a difficult financial situation. When things were desperate, they would sell themselves into enslavement too, right? Which we just talked about. And yet, the Jubilee ensured that this was set right every generation. Having a nation of Israelites without their own land and all of them enslaved because they couldn't afford to live, this would have just brought the Israelites back full circle into enslavement again, which would have negated the entire liberation process of the Exodus, right?
Correct.
So these Jubilee laws were to make sure that they didn't become landless wanderers or enslaved people, just like they were in Egypt, or in debt to somebody else, right? Just like they were in Egypt at some level. So all of this was to ensure that they stayed freed people, right? So returning land to its original family was an effort to prevent generational poverty, right? Even think about today. Generational poverty is a huge thing. If your parents and grandparents were really poor, it's likely that you could get stuck in that, right? If you're not given some opportunity. So land ownership was connected to the economic stability and building wealth. So those are the three big things. Anything you want to add? There's some other little things, but those are the three big ones.
No, what is interesting about that, maybe aside from the burying of the ancestors, which at least in this country is no longer allowed, but a lot of people who still are living in rural places on farms or on like little farmettes and stuff like that, some of these practices are still put into place. This idea of passing down farms and passing down fields and passing down generational farming wealth. My grandparents were dairy farmers. My parents were dairy farmers. I'm a dairy farmer. These cows have been in this same pasture for over 100 years.
Yeah.
We think that some of that stuff has gone away, but in a lot of rural places, it has not. And nor should it. That's not what I'm advocating for. Nor should it. So,
one of the classes I teach to college students is sociology, which has a lot to do with economics. And one of the first things that I teach my students, which a lot of them, when they're like 18 years old, are not aware of, is that income disparities is different than wealth disparities. Income is like money, like dollars in the bank. Wealth is things like, oh, my dad has a farm and I inherited it, or my parents gave me their house. A boat, right, is wealth. Even something as small as like your parents gave you a car, that's inherited wealth. And if you've ever taken an economic or sociology class, you know that inherited wealth can actually go farther as far as opportunity goes than inherited income or earned income. So I think that's really interesting. So wealth is no joke. So in the Jubilee year, whenever land is given back to its original family, that's making sure that wealth is not hoarded by people who have the means to take it, right?
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's a really economic system that is taking place here.
Yeah, and owning land is no joke because
it's connected to your right to vote in history.
Right, and also many many people who own a lot of land, and especially if it's farmland, they will rent that out to other farmers, and because they're the owners of the land, they can get farm rent for that, land rent. And so that sustains them. If they're not actually doing the actual labor of the farming, but it is their land, and so therefore because they have had that for generations, they are able to kind of reap the benefit of that land rent. And in Europe in particular, and in colonial America, the people who had those types of farms and those types of land were called the landed gentry.
Yeah, gentry is a good word.
The gentry. They were the landed gentry. They weren't nobility. They weren't aristocrats. They weren't royal, but they were able to own land, and they were the landed gentry. And they would rent their land that they owned out to other people, and that would continue their status in society, and it would guarantee that for generations their family would be taken care of.
Yes. So we have the mass data abilities now. I couldn't point to the study. I should have looked it up before this, but we have the ability to crunch mass numbers now with the amount of data that we have and with technology. And if you look at empires that crumble, and I mean empire literally, but also just systems in general, the major reason empires fall, the one common denominator over and over and over again that we see is an exponentially growing gap between the wealthy and the poor. And notice that I said the wealthy. I didn't say the rich or the people with high incomes, although that sometimes is connected for complicated and not so complicated reasons. But the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. And the Jubilee and these three things are all about that, right? So if every 50 years, if once a generation, all debts had to be forgiven, what does that mean? It means that people on the bottom don't continue to gather debt, further oppressing them, and people at the top don't keep making money off the people at the bottom. So it closes that gap between the wealthy and the poor. If you have to, if all free people are enslaved, obviously, that's a huge part of that gap as well. Because if you're enslaved, that means you have nothing. You don't get to earn wealth. You don't get to have income. You don't have any of that. You don't have resources. But this last one about returning land, like we were just talking about, land has everything to do with having wealth or not having wealth. If you are able to grow your own food because you have your own family plot of land, that means you get to go to the marketplace and sell and trade your food, right? That is the income back then. They didn't have green paper dollars as we know them today. That was the income. That's how you survived. So land, this Jubilee law was to make sure that that gap between the wealthy and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, did not grow too big, because that's how everything falls apart. And we know that because data time and time again, when towns crumble and fall apart at every level, not just fall apart, but like more violence, higher rates of unwanted pregnancies, what are some other big social issues? You name it. Higher levels, unhoused people, unemployed people,
Better
healthcare, physical health, well-being, mental health. We have that data now. Every part of society crumbles when the gap between the wealthy and the poor gets too big. It all falls apart because we're not meant to live that way. We're not meant to live where some people have everything and other people have barely nothing. It doesn't work. There's something about the laws of reality. It does not sustain itself. It falls apart. And we're seeing that right now too in the United States. It's happening right in front of us. It can't sustain itself.
There's an interesting thing about the land, though. So that's where you get things like landlord.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
We still use that today. The lord of the land.
Yeah.
Owns your home or owns the field that you that you plant and then harvest. And so the lord of the land is the owner of the land. But it's interesting that land can only be fostered and cared for through people, through tenants. Mm-hmm. And so tenants are having, there's homes there, there's gardens there, there's fields there, there's other types of maybe manufacturing. And what's interesting is in the United States, this might seem like I'm trying to support or promote keeping people in landlord-tenant agreements. That's not what I'm saying. But there is an interesting thing because the Lord would also own the tractors that are needed and own the tools that are needed to do the farming, to collect the crops, to get the eggs, to do all these things. So then someone becomes liberated, or they become freed, and now they can have their own plot of land, but they can't afford a tractor. and they can't afford all these different things. So
Right.
sometimes when someone says liberation, we have to question, what does that mean?
Right.
You
In
know,
our American value system, we think independence means liberation of like, oh, I have a mortgage and I can have my own house, which great, that's beautiful. That is so great if that's something anybody wants for themselves. And yet that's not the end all be all just because you get to have your own plot of land now. There are also systems where it's mutually beneficial for a renter and a landlord. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, what I'm saying is, as long as, you know, for some of the stories that we were talking about, we were talking about enslavement. These people were enslaved. There's also agreements under landlord-tenant agreements where these things are mutual, where someone decides to be a tenant. There is a lord of the land,
Right.
and there's a mutual agreement that we're going to provide you with housing and safety and all these things, the tools. And yes, you'll pay a rent or you'll do something like that, but we're going to be working together. It's a back and forth.
Well, that's what Exodus chapter 1 is talking about,
Right.
when it says enslavement cannot last longer than 6 years, which is essentially like to get this person up and going again. Yes,
Right.
they're going to be an enslaved member of the household. Yes, it's exploited labor. Yes, they're being pulled from their family, and that is terrible and gruesome, and I'm glad we moved beyond it, and it's never
right.
okay. But in this social setup, Exodus 21 states that, that's the setup. That's what we're working with because their consciousness wasn't beyond that point yet. Enslavement was part of the social setup. However, enslavement was limited to 6 years. And then it says the enslaved person could choose to remain, right? And if they chose to remain, a whole other set of rules now kicked in. Similar to what Dillon's talking, now not exactly, but similar to what Dillon's talking about with this like landlord-rentee relationship is how we would describe it now. Of like, now they're not quite enslaved, but they can choose to remain in this life of servitude.
Because in some cases, true freedom and independence, or liberation, whatever word you want to use, is also quite a danger. Now you have someone who has not been formally educated. They can't read or write. They don't know how to manage funds in terms of money.
You're talking about modern day.
Yeah.
Like if you were to free
so
somebody.
Like if you were to, what we're talking about is a very beautiful, wonderful thing, and yet it is actually deeply complicated.
Okay, so yes, you're actually making a really good point that we should talk about.
Deeply complicated.
Number one, these things, so imagine it's a Jubilee year and you've been enslaved for the past 40 years. You are not just being set free, you're being set free into a world where chances are you are enslaved because you were crippled by debt and couldn't afford a life. But now you're freed into a world where your debt's gone because debt is also forgiven. Oh, and that family land that you had to sell to just make ends meet before you were put into enslavement because you couldn't exactly make ends meet, that land you sold, that's returned to you as well. So the Jubilee laws, they didn't just say, oh, you're enslaved and now you're freed. They made sure they had a social setup to forgive debts, to give you back your land, meaning giving you back a job and saying, here, go farm, go do the thing. You now have a way to be, yes, yeah, Dillon just whispered 40 acres and a mule. So let's actually really ground this and talk about United States, not so historic history. We took Africans, we shipped them over, literally, by the shipload. White people, us, our ancestors, enslaved them. And then we fought a war about it, and we thought, okay, let's free them. So we freed them. But we didn't have Jubilee laws. We just said, you're free. We didn't educate them. We didn't do the equivalent of forgiving debt and giving them land back. Lincoln said, hey, we're going to give you 40 acres and a mule. And then what happened? Lincoln was shot, as most, I'm going to call him a prophet, as most prophets are. And a martyr. He was killed. And then that 40 acres was taken away. So the black people were not given their land. They were not given an education. They were not given a way to provide for themselves like the Jubilee law was doing for the Israelites. So, and you bet your bottom dollar we're seeing the repercussions for that still today. And there's so much suffering because we are not living into a modern day Jubilee system of economics. right? So this isn't just something from thousands of years ago. It's still happening today. When we free people, as we should always be doing, we're going to talk about liberation in a couple minutes. When we liberate people, we need to have a Jubilee mindset. We need to have Jubilee policies, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
That's really important. So I also want to say that the concept of a Jubilee year, if you're interested in this and you're reading the Bible, and it's not just the word Jubilee. So that's talked about in Leviticus, but like an example is Isaiah chapter 61 discusses the year of the Lord's favor. This also refers to the Jubilee year. Sometimes it was called the year of the Lord's favor. So Isaiah 61 really doubles down on themes of Jubilee. It mentions the good news for the oppressed, liberty for the captives, right? Freeing people, release of prisoners, right? So this Jubilee can really extend to a lot of things, and it has extended. So it's not just about the enslaved, it's also prisoners, right? You could talk about prison reform. We don't have enough time to do that on this episode. We could do a whole episode about it, but prison reform, freeing prisoners is a part of that. You look like you have something.
No, I think there's a beauty, and I mean, there's a beauty in all world religions. All world religions have some type of,
Liberation.
days of joy or days of jubilee or something like that. But in the Jewish and Christian traditions, which is, our heritage, it's interesting because we have two very ancient religions that have and remain seeing the need for moments of time to take time and set it aside during elongated periods, to have moments, whether it's a day, whether it's a year, of jubilance, of joy, days of joy, years of joy.
Yeah.
And so it's not always like, I have to go back to the millstone, or I have to go back to the grind, and it's just we never ever get a break. There's literally, in the Jewish and Christian traditions, there's literally built-in time.
Right.
For
there's the
days
Sabbath day every 7 days. There's the sabbatical year where it's not just for humans, it's all of creation. Every 7th year has to rest. And then every 7 cycles of 7 sabbatical years, now we celebrate the Jubilee, where we set everybody free, and we have a system in place to make sure they stay free.
Right, and even like I said in the beginning, in more liturgical churches that have the seasons of Advent and Lent, these kind of elongated preparatory seasons for these big coming holy days and festivals, you even see these 2 little moments of joy and jubilee in those seasons too. So it's literally baked into the pie,
into the political, economic, social systems. Yeah. So Jesus references the Jubilee as well. In Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, he says that he is here to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, which is pointing to the Jubilee.
And pointing to almost directly to that passage that's in Isaiah.
Yes, he's pointing to the Isaiah text. And Jesus goes around constantly talking about bringing good news to the poor and releasing the captives, right? That's Jubilee. He's talking about the Jubilee because he was a student of the Torah and a teacher of the Torah. He understood the Jubilee. Now, by the time Jesus came around, they were no longer practicing the Jubilee. So by no means were the Israelites. It's very debated among scholars how long and how regularly the Jubilee was actually practiced. That's very debated. Some say it was as little as 2 times around, so 100 years. Others say that it was more than that.
Well, it's really interesting because, some Christian denominations, that they don't focus on Jubilee years at all. You could grow up being a practicing Christian your whole life and know nothing about the Jubilee year, because there's denominations that have just like, in slightly including the Lutheran Church, we don't do much with the Jubilee. We kind of sprinkle it throughout and talk about it every once in a while when it comes up in the lectionary, which is the assigned readings for a Sunday, but we don't really do anything formally with it. And some denominations don't do anything with it. They just have forgotten it. And it's really interesting too, not to get back to these 2 days, but the 3rd Sunday in Advent and the 4th Sunday in Lent those days of joy in those preparatory seasons. Even some more liturgical churches, they've just done away with that too. They just keep on going. They go through the whole thing of Advent, the whole season of Advent. They go through the whole season of Lent, and they don't even mention the little spark of joy in the midst of it. It's just like, that's not really needed. Let's just move forward.
Well, and this is why it's important to remember that Jesus was Jewish. He was a Jew. He understood the Jubilee. He understood the kind of, again, I keep using these terms, but political, economic, and social setup that the Jewish people were trying to create, right? He understood that. When he said the kingdom of God is drawing near, that's what he was talking about. He was talking about the Romans falling, the Roman Empire falling, and the Jewish way coming back into reality. And the Jubilee was part of that. That's part of what Jesus was advocating for. So I hope we've really made the point that the Jubilee is all about human liberation and also just creation liberation. It's about the land as well. It's about all of us. Human, land. I want to say animal, but I view humans as animals, but you know what I mean? Like just all of us. So I want to talk about liberation because the Jubilee cannot be understood if you don't understand what is liberation. The Israelites were freed from Egypt, and then their entire story was about maintaining liberation. That's why there's the sabbatical year, and the Jubilee. It is all about liberation. How can we create systems that keep everybody free? One of my favorite things to say, Dillon knows this, is if it is not liberation for everybody, it is not liberation. It can only be liberation if it's liberation for everybody. It has to be liberation for all. So I'm going to be pretty direct. Are you ready?
I would expect nothing but.
I'm going to speak as a woman. If you are a woman and you have ever voiced your opinion in public, on social media, at church, or specifically to a man, that is because of feminists who came before you, who did very dangerous things, and some of them died for you. You were liberated because people who came before you worked really hard to liberate you so you could vote, so you could have an opinion, so you could exist and show your ankles and knees and face out in public, so you could have a job and earn money and get a divorce and leave an abusive man and even talk to a man in public. So if you are a woman who enjoys any of those freedoms, then you better be working really hard to free everybody else. Everybody else. Women in the United States and many other places today, we're allowed to be out in public. We're allowed to tell a man our opinion. We're allowed to go to school. We're allowed to read without getting our eyes gouged out or our fingers cut off. We are allowed to be in the workplace. We're allowed to show our face. We're allowed to vote. We're allowed to not get raped. That has not always been against the law, y'all. But because of feminists, it is now. We're allowed to vote. We're allowed to own a home. We're allowed to have our own money. We're allowed to have a bank account. We're allowed to just generally exist out loud because people worked for that liberation. So we better be working hard to liberate everybody else. We can't just want women to be free. We need to want everybody to be free. We don't get to enjoy that liberation for ourselves. We don't get to have Jubilee rights for ourselves, but not for everybody else. Dillon's already heard me say this a million times, so this is nothing new. So whenever I'm out in the wild and I hear women talking against like queer people, gay people, disabled people, anything like that, I just want to be like, do you not know that the fact that you even get to have an opinion out loud is because of people who came before you fighting for your liberation when people with power did not want women to be free? In fact, there's a lot of people with power right now who still don't want women to be free. So we need to want women to be free. Yes, of course. We need to want men to be liberated from the expectation that they don't need to be tough all the time. Did you know that about 97% of all homicides globally are done by men? Men. So humans are not killing machines, men are. Because our society places this unrealistic, inhumane expectation on men that they must kill or be killed. They're not allowed to cry. They're not allowed to be human. They're not allowed to be sad. They're not allowed to grieve, right? So we need to work for the liberation of men. We need to want people in the queer community to be free. People of color suffering from our racist systems, people suffering from addictions, people suffering from the illusion that they are in control, people suffering because they have a huge grandiose sense of self, because they have too small a sense of self, because they're anxious or they're depressed or they have mental health issues, they're struggling physically, people who take themselves too seriously. people who are angry, people who are obsessed with making money and buying more things, people who want so badly to please everybody all the time.
Oh boy. I think that one was for me.
Right? There's countless things people need to be liberated from. We cannot want liberation only for ourselves. That's not permanent. That is not lasting liberation. And the Israelites understood this. Jesus understood this. There's a reason why Jesus went around liberating everybody. He could have just enjoyed his own peace of mind and freedom that he experienced through God. Instead, he went around telling everybody else that they can be free too. And when you are free, like really step into freedom. And listen, y'all, I'm here to tell you that I have not. I have moments, like I think a lot of us do. I have glimpses of it, but I have not fully stepped into this liberation. But I know a few people who have. And once you are truly free, sometimes I can hold on to that liberation for a while. But once you are truly free, you can't help but want it for everybody else. That's the nature of liberation, true liberation, right? Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I want to say something very quickly. I think that it's interesting because if someone were to sit in church on a Sunday morning or another day that they might attend church and hear the stories of Jesus, and where he's inviting people who are sick and people who are dying and people who have disease, and he's inviting women and he's inviting children and he's inviting all kinds of homeless people and all kinds of people who are poor, and he's inviting all these people who are on the margins of society. In some ways, in our modern day way of thinking in 2025, we think like, yeah, of course, right? Of course, that's the right thing to do. And yet, what Jesus was doing for his time, and arguably even now, was the most radical in that you would invite those people, actually that you would share a meal with those people.
Radical,
absolutely radical. That was not going on.
You weren't allowed to do that.
That was not going on. So we have kind of, when we read those stories, we're not getting the fullness of what they meant, and
how
and
outside the norms Jesus
and what they
was.
can still mean for people today, new groups of people that we are coming to open ourselves up to understand that yes, they matter too. They're a part of the community too. They
need to be part of the systems that we create.
Correct, and they need to be. They are who Jesus was and is talking about.
Yes.
Especially, I think, especially groups today that we think don't matter or aren't a part of what Jesus was talking about. Like, oh, well, it doesn't say that specifically. Yeah, well, the whole idea of it is that Jesus's radical teachings are inclusive of all things. And not only are they inclusive, but they're expansive. They have an elasticity to them.
When Jesus punches, he punches up. He never punches down. Jesus takes a side. I do want to be clear about that. When Jesus says love your enemies, he's not saying love. I said this in the last episode too. He's not saying love the Romans. He's saying love the Samaritan, love the widow. He's saying love the people who are not being taken care of by the political, economic, and social systems. That's what he's saying. He never punches down, he only punches up. He never critiques down, he only critiques up. The Jesus story has everything to do with the political, economic, and social systems that exist.
Also, I think of the story the story of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Didn't we do an episode on Samaritan, didn't we?
I
can't remember now. Okay.
No. That story in its historic context, when I mean historic context, I mean the Samaritans of the day. I'm not talking about
Samaritans were hated.
I'm not talking about the historic. A parable is not something of history. A parable is a telling of a story. I think everyone knows that. But
original audiences would have understood
Right.
the power
And
of
not-
saying, love the Samaritan.
Right, and not only that, but the Samaritan wasn't even on the same religious wavelength that Jesus was. They worshipped very differently. They understood God very differently. And it's interesting that even Jesus is uplifting the Good Samaritan, somebody who's very religiously different than Jesus, over a priest in Jesus' own religious tradition. That is wild.
Yeah.
That is absolutely wild.
Yeah. It's,
He didn't say, and I'm not trying to make a definitive statement here, but there is no part of the parable of the Good Samaritan in which Jesus ever mentions any type of religious conversion.
right.
There.
I was just going to say that.
He says that that person is acting in a way that is godly, but he's not saying, oh, well, this person became a Jew or this person became a Christian. This person arguably maybe stayed in their own religious tradition and yet was a very godly person. They took their faith and they put it into action.
Yeah, that's good. Well, let's talk about what a liberated person looks like, right? You know a free person when you see them. We've all met maybe a couple of them.
Yeah, I'm not one of them.
Yeah, I have moments, but I'll be
was.
super honest.
I wish I was.
I'll be super honest about my liberated moments. They happen when I wake up and I'm feeling very healthy, very clear-minded, when I'm experiencing absolutely no suffering and I'm very comfortable, when I'm by myself and there are no other people to complicate my liberated state. Like, my liberation has to be very particular and handed to me on a silver platter, which is how you know it's not real liberation, because liberation is liberation even whenever you're sick, even when there is suffering, even whenever your children are running around screaming in their outdoor voices whenever it's 7 a.m. and you have neighbors. Liberation is liberation all the time. So my liberation comes, but everything has to line up just right. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do.
So I do rub against it. A free person, let's just start listing some things. I have a list here. They laugh easily. They are not easily offended. They do not make decisions based on fear. In fact, there's little evidence that fear even runs the show for them. They make decisions not based on fear, right? Fear does not make the decisions for them. There's kind of this light joy about the way they walk through the world. They forgive easily. They are very slow to anger. They don't need much external validation. For Dillon and I, that's a big one. We are both firstborns, and in very different ways, Dillon and I want validation. In very different ways, but it is there for both of us as firstborn children.
Maybe we can move on.
A liberated person can express their true feelings without being afraid of judgment. A liberated person is not rigid in their behaviors or their beliefs. They are not focused on material possessions, wealth, or social status. Possessions and wealth, those are not two things that I'm hung up on, but status. I love those letters behind my name. I'm not proud of that, so I'm a little hung up on that. I'm just trying to be honest.
A lot of people love a good title.
Yeah. A liberated person has no issue speaking up when things are wrong or harmful. They are often creative. They're kind of like playful, right? They don't have negative self-talk or very little of it. They're very honest about their emotions. They're very present in their body. They're not afraid of making mistakes. They're not afraid of failing, right? Like these are, anything else coming up for you? A liberated person just walks through the world in a certain way. It doesn't mean they don't have beliefs, but they're not rigid about them. They don't need everybody to agree with them, right? Another way to say a liberated person is just the fruits of the Spirit listed in the Bible, which are what? Do you know them off the top of your head?
Love, I have to do it on my fingers. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and self-control.
There you go.
But, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a liberated person, right?
Yeah.
So if you step into liberation, you experience all of these things, and you can't help but want to liberate everybody else.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the fruits of the Spirit is that everyone has those. They're unlike the other gifts of the Spirit, that sometimes one has one gift and another person has a different gift. The fruits of the Spirit, everyone has those. Mm-hmm. And so when we allow the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, to, I'm using very religious language here, but move us and convict us and guide us and lead us, all those,
Well, yeah,
those,
let's actually get theological about this.
Mm-hmm.
The fruits of, we could do a whole episode on the fruits of the Spirit, but
Yeah, they're very good.
Yeah,
I'm
the
going to be
fruits
talking
of
about them
this-
tomorrow.
there you go. The fruits of the Spirit, for me, they are not something to work towards because, like you said, we all already have them. It's not about doing more in order to receive it. It's actually about having less so we can rid ourselves of the pain and the distraction in order to sink into those parts of us. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, you don't work you don't,
don't
work,
work
to
for
get
it.
the fruits of them.
You quiet everything down so you can experience them.
Right. So yeah, let's talk about this really quick. The fruits of the Spirit, you are the tree.
Yes.
You are the tree, and from the tree comes the fruit. So you don't have to become the tree. You already are the tree.
But you do have to prune a little bit
Correct.
to make sure it grows.
Yeah.
I could beat a metaphor till it's dead. Yeah.
Jesus' parable of the fig tree, and about which is actually coming up for the third Sunday of Lent, that Jesus tells the parable of the fig tree, and repentance and pruning is part of preparing for good fruit. Mm-hmm. If you let a tree grow and you don't prune it, you don't turn around towards the sun, you don't place it in a place where it's going to bear good fruit, it's going to die.
Right.
Any good producer, and when I mean producer, I mean a person who takes care of fruits and vegetables, knows that the pruning of trees is vital to growth.
Right, and pruning has everything to do with getting rid of stuff. Like, let's actually ground this. I don't mind being honest about my stuff, so let me think of an example. Self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. This all has to do with liberation and Jubilee, by the way. So a fruit of the Spirit is self-control. As a mother and a professor and a writer, I'm currently in the process of working with my editor, editing my book chapter by chapter, and it's a lot of work. I am teaching, which is a lot of work. I am mothering, which is a lot of work. I'm on some community committees, which can be a lot of work. Just like everybody else, right? Everybody has a lot of stuff. I have my stuff too. Self-control, if I wake up and I am super overwhelmed, I don't have self-control. And I'm sure there's a neuropsychological way to explain that, something about my hippocampus and my amygdala and blah, blah. But if I am overwhelmed, I do not have self-control. So in order to make sure that the fruit of self-control is growing on the tree that is me, that is present and growing on the tree that is me, I need to prune back some parts of my life. I need to cut out. Maybe I'm on one committee and I just can't do it right now. I got to say no thank you. Maybe I need a little bit of help with mothering. So I tell Dillon, like, hey, I need the day tomorrow. You have to figure something out. Or I reach out to a grandparent, or we get a babysitter, or whatever's within our means to do, right? So pruning and like getting rid, or I really like audiobooks, but there are times in life where I just need silence because I'm getting overwhelmed and I don't have this self-control growing. So I need to, does that make sense? Yeah. So I need to like prune parts back, right? So part of liberation is not having more. It's actually about pruning and having less. Liberation, there are characteristics of a liberated person, and what is true for an individual is true at large of a society. A liberated society or community has to prune back, right? I think about churches. If you want to have a liberated church, a church community, you can't operate from more. You can't be one of those churches who's like, let's record this and let's do like Wednesday night prayer and Saturday worship and Sunday worship, and then let's do an alternative after the Sunday worship, and let's do Sunday school and this and that. Where it's like, okay, let's have a little less, because that's how we can have the fruits of the Spirit, the self-control, is patience one of them?
Yeah, which I deeply struggle with.
All of those. Is joy one of them?
Yep.
Because joy for me is a big one. I very much believe in joy. I very much believe in following joy, doing whatever you can so that joy branch can grow that joy fruit can grow.
Well,
Am I making any sense?
No, you are. And one of the dangers of not having the fullness of the fruits of the Spirit, which comes out of liberation, which comes out of joy and jubilee, is when you're not caring for that which you are, you can't have its fullness. And what do I mean by that? If you are everything to everybody, there is no depth. If a church is doing 50 million things, everything is at its surface.
Yes, if you as a person
Very
are doing 50 million things, you're not doing any of them with depth. With depth.
You're gonna struggle with the depth of something. Mm-hmm. And the message of Jesus in terms of Jubilee is literally, joy and Jubilee are literally getting to the depths of where you have come from. You've come from this long year, this long 50 years, this long 25 years of doing something, and now you get to be liberated and free. You get to reflect on that which you have come from, and you get to seek joy and jubilee from that, and you get to experience that in its depths. Why can you do that? Because you're literally getting a break from that which you've been doing for years. Does that make sense?
It does. And notice that the Jubilee is not saying, here's $100. It's not giving you more. It's getting rid of debt.
Right.
It's getting rid of things. It's pruning things. It's saying no more debt, no more enslavement. Now it's giving you land, but it's giving you back your land and like resetting things. It's not giving you more, because sometimes giving more is not the answer. It's pruning back and resetting things to its neutral state, to its original. I don't know how to say that, but yeah, that's good. So all of that is to say that liberation is not something to achieve. It's actually, I believe, something we surrender to. So it's not about working hard to become liberated. It's kind of a paradox. It's about letting go of that which is unnecessary or cluttering our lives so we can actually see the liberation that has been there all along. Also, when we see it, we go around helping everybody else see it and experience it too. What's really difficult is that we're not all just individual people, right? We are all operating within systems, and some systems do make this liberation really difficult for certain people and communities. That's what the Jubilee is all about. So liberation is not just something, this is really important. Liberation is not an individual choice, and for some people, systems make it really hard for some people to experience liberation or to have the fruits of the Spirit, right? Like, yes, it's present, but sometimes systems can really oppress people to the point that they can't experience it. So the Jubilee is about addressing those systems, those political systems, those economic systems, those social systems that keep people from experiencing liberation. Because liberation can be experienced individually, it's also deeply communal, right? And that's where systems come in. So I know that I keep saying it, but I think it's important. It's the whole point. I believe the whole Christian story is about liberation. I actually believe the whole reason we're here is because God is slowly pulling, and slow is the key word, right? God's got time, and truly we've got time too. So God is slowly pulling us all at our own pace more away from our chains and more towards liberation. And if we just surrender to it and allow it, liberation is there to be experienced. So if we believe that only some should be free, that actually exposes our own lack of liberation. We have not stepped in to the really powerful liberation that comes from really feeling divine love and acceptance and forgiveness and mercy and freedom, right? All those things. Once you see a liberated person, you know it because they walk around freeing everybody else. That's all Jesus did. If you look at his entire ministry, he just walked around freeing people all the time. And you know what's really interesting is he was killed for it, right? So Jesus understood divine liberation. Once you taste that liberation, you go around feeding it to everybody else. It's the only way it works. It's the only way it works. People who are enslaved to something they won't see it as liberation. Unliberated people killed Jesus because he went around freeing people. And people who are not free, they don't want others to be free either. Do you believe that?
I do.
Yeah, that's theological, y'all. So, so if you want to be free, help liberate everybody else. And if you already want to liberate everybody, if you already see the world through this Christian lens, understand that you can't do this effectively if you haven't tasted your own freedom. So I want to say this. I've been thinking, I'm doing this like on the cuff here, so tell me if it makes sense, Dillon, but I've been noticing that there are some people who are really, really angry about politics or this social issue or that issue. And anger is righteous. Anger is a good place to start. We can't stay there, but it's a good place to start, right? It's even a valid place to start. But some people are angry and they want other people to be free. They're fighting for the rights of other people, except there's no evidence that they actually experience their own freedom.
Yeah.
We cannot free other people if we don't sink into our own liberation. Mm-hmm. It's a two-way street. We can't experience our own liberation if we're not liberating others, but we also cannot liberate others if we are not experiencing our own liberation. And I'm actually just going to use the bold language. I see a lot of, and I'm talking about really radical here, I see a lot of really radical people on the right side of the political spectrum who don't really want to free other people. They just want liberation for themselves. And that's not how it works. But then I see a lot of really radical people on the left side of our political spectrum. They really want to free everybody else, but they don't experience freedom themselves. They're angry all the time and they have no joy and they have no patience and they're clearly not in their own state of liberation. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, no, I very much agree with that.
But we need both, right? You can fight for the rights of other people while still having joy and patience and kindness and liberation, right? Like, you are a free person to some degree, so enjoy it. Otherwise, why do you want other people to have it if you have it? And to some degree, whatever that varying degree is, we all have some freedom. And if you don't enjoy it, if you don't taste it, why would you want other people to taste it, right? It has to be both. It has to be both.
When individuals are baptized in the Lutheran Church and then they affirm their baptism, whether they are confirmed as a teenager or they affirm their baptism later on in life, through an affirmation of baptism, it's interesting. One of the questions that is presented to the person who's confirming their faith and affirming their faith after they've been baptized is, will you serve all people following the example of Jesus? That is the question. And will you serve all people following the example of Jesus? Every time I myself, because I am a person of brokenness and sin, I always think like, oh, I can't stand that person, or oh, I can't stand that group, or oh, I just disagree with them so much and I just can't get on board with that. I am reminded of my own baptism and my own confirmation that I am called to serve and love all people following the example of Jesus. That doesn't mean I have to agree with them, but I need to see them as a person
worthy of liberation,
worth and dignity, as a child of God who has different thoughts than I do. And if I'm a follower of Jesus and I'm have confirmed my baptism, then I need to serve all people. Now I'm talking in very Lutheran language here. That means I don't get to pick and choose who I want to love or care for. Who's deserving. Oh, well, I don't like Democrats, or I don't like Republicans, or, oh, well, rich people. I don't like... It's everybody. Because that's the example of Jesus.
Yes, and when Dillon says serve, I again want to really ground this. Oh. That doesn't just mean like, oh, I don't get to decide who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. No. No. We're actually talking in a much more profound sense. We're talking in a very concrete, literal sense here. We're talking politics. We're talking economy. We're talking about who has rights. And people don't, let's talk about the word politics. That's another one we'll do a whole episode on. I don't mean like pastors should stand up and say who to vote for. I'm saying politics is like, politics just means how we arrange our lives together. The law, the rules, who gets help, who gets an education, who doesn't, all of these things, right? So as a Christian, we're called to serve all. That has to do with right here and now, like our systems that we create, policies at church, right? All of it, like all of it,
yeah,
the system.
It's very interesting too, because like Jesus's whole, like if Jesus was around today, Jesus was eating with people who were excluded, eating with them. Mm-hmm. When you eat with somebody, you get very intimate. I'm not talking about romantically, but you get very intimate with them. You see what's on their plate. You see the way that they eat. You see the way that they converse, why they eat. You're sitting next to them, somewhat near a table or around some type of counter or something. And eating a meal with a person, sharing a meal with a person is a very intimate encounter. And that's what Jesus did. And it was very bold for his time. And it can be still very bold even to this day. And again, as the Lutheran baptism and confirmation services read, will you love and serve all people following the example of Jesus? I think to myself, like, we need to start asking better questions. We really need to live into the Jubilee of liberating and freeing people after a long passage of time of where they have been, and see where they're going, and ask, like, so for instance, I had a conversation with someone, and they said, this person is they kind of smell, and they're not really bathing a lot, and it's just their body odor is so bad, like I can't be near them. Okay, that's fine, that's valid. I understand that, and I understand why it might be difficult to be next to them, and yet the question that Jesus would ask is, why does that person smell? Mm-hmm. Why does that person smell? In what situation or what place is that person in, and how did they get there? And how might you be like Jesus to help get them out of maybe they can't afford deodorant. Maybe their water has been shut off. Maybe they're finding it difficult because they're aging, and Jesus invites us to be in a place of joy and jubilee after a long period to which someone might be in, and come alongside them. Maybe it's us, or maybe we're that person that someone else needs to come alongside and help us. But it's asking good questions. Am I on a bunny trail?
No, that's good.
I mean, instead of just saying like, oh, well this, or oh, well that, or I don't like this group, or I don't like that group, or, well, why? Asking the questions, why?
Right. It's
who,
the thing behind the thing.
Yeah, who is this person? Who is this group?
How did they
arrive here? Why are they acting like
right.
this?
And the Jubilee actually takes it a step further, which is not just how did this person arrive here, but how can we ensure that nobody arrives here again, right? That's what the Jubilee was, which is like, okay, we understand that sometimes debt is a part of reality, but once a generation, we're going to forgive debt. That way people don't become enslaved to it and then hand it down to their kids and their kids and their kids. And before you know it, oh my gosh, there's a growing gap between the wealthy and the poor, and our entire system is crumbling, and we're just enslaved again. So, yeah, that's good. All of this just from the word Jubilee. So 2025 is a Jubilee year, and you might be asking yourself, well, that doesn't sound like every 50 years. So it started out every 50 years, every 7 cycles of sabbatical years. However, now they tend to be, Dillon, you might know more about this, they tend to be every 25 years now. The Pope usually deems every 25 years a Jubilee year, and it's not as systemic as it used to be. It's not an official forgiving of debts, although you do see that a little bit popping up here and there, but it's not forgiving of debts. Enslavement is not a regular practice in places like Rome. But there is a lot of liberation going on. So we were there in Rome. Did you see any like huge Jubilee things? There were a lot of groups advocating for liberation there for the Jubilee year. Go ahead.
The Jubilee year has really evolved. So the Roman Catholic Church actually formally observes Jubilee years every 25 years. And it is announced by the Pope, who's the Bishop of Rome, and Samantha and I are not Roman Catholics, so we don't know the total details of that.
But I did learn the Rosary prayer while in Rome.
Yes, which is a very beautiful prayer. So we don't know the full. I wouldn't want to lead someone astray because I don't know the full Roman Catholic teachings around the Jubilee. But what I do know is that the Roman Catholic Church does take the Jubilee very seriously.
It's connected to liberation.
The Pope announces it usually every 25 years.
There are events about it.
And it's a formal practiced thing. One thing that's very interesting as to how it kind of has evolved is it really has become a whole year of jubilance or joy. So we're giving joy and praise back to God for what God has given us. So it's once again this moment or season in time in which we practice jubilance or joy.
Yeah, and you just said something really interesting. The Jubilee year, it's connected to the seventh day of rest, which is Sabbath, and every 7 years, the sabbatical year where the land rests. So it's about this rest, but it's also about this remembering that God led the Israelites out of enslavement into liberation. Again, this liberation theme. And it's about looking forward to liberation at a regularly scheduled time built into systems that create society. But it's also about remembering when we feel enslaved to something, whether it's we can't stop drinking 3 glasses of wine every night after work, or maybe we are in very serious active addiction, or we can't stop shopping, or we can't stop using credit cards, or we can't stop yelling at our children, or we have hoarding tendencies, or whatever it is that we are enslaved to. It's about remembering. So this is a Jubilee year, which is a built-in time for Roman Catholics and some others to remember God can lead you out of it. You just have to allow yourself to be led.
Right, and it invites you into a relationship with your Creator, in that which you have been given, you give praise to God for, and so you give thanks to God for.
Yeah.
So
God instructed God's people to observe the Jubilee, and it's all about liberation.
Excellent.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
To understand